Hello, I'm Kirk Hanson. I'm Executive Director of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. We have with us as our guest today Hank Shea. Hank, for 20 years, was a prosecutor in Minneapolis, a federal prosecutor prosecuting white-collar crime, particularly corporate directors and corporate executives. Hank is now a Senior Distinguished Fellow at the University of St. Thomas. He also teaches at the law school at the University of Arizona. Hank, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Kirk, it's my pleasure to be back.
Great. Now, this morning we talked to a board of directors here in San Francisco, and you gave some pretty hard lessons about what it was like for you to prosecute directors of corporations and why directors got in trouble. Give us the highlights of why did directors end up on your plate as a federal prosecutor? What do they do that makes them suddenly get in trouble?
Well, there's three ways you can get in trouble as a member of a board of directors, and the first doesn't end up on the plate of a prosecutor, and that's the most common, where people make mistakes through acts of negligence or bad decision making. Mm-hmm. They, as a board member, find themselves accused of doing something wrong, failure to supervise, failure to monitor, and that can result in all sorts of civil liability.
Not criminal, but civil.
Civil. And we saw that in the case of the Enron Board of Directors, the WorldCom Board of Directors, and the like. Mm-hmm. That's the vast majority of misconduct. But there are two other areas that all board members should be aware of. The middle ground is what's called the area of willful blindness, where a board of director is aware of wrongdoing, has the both responsibility and ability to do something about it, and for whatever reason does nothing.
So it isn't that they've done something wrong, but they're aware of it occurring within the firm.
That's correct. Now, this theory has been an evolving theory, and it can either lead to civil liability or criminal liability. But in the last 10 years or so, the courts have increasingly been finding that gatekeepers, people who are in these positions of responsibility, can, and in some cases should be held accountable when others commit misconduct that could have been stopped, that could have been altered, and the board member or the general counsel or the CFO did nothing. They deliberately ignored the obvious, did not ask the right questions when wrongdoing was brought to their attention, and ultimately allowed it to continue.
So this is the board that decides not to pursue something deliberately, even though they know there is some kind of wrongdoing, because if they know more, they may be obligated to do more or to take some kind of action.
It clearly applies in that type of case, but let me give you an actual example. The chairman of a board of a hospital in Texas found out that the executive director had not been forwarding taxes to the IRS that had been withheld from employees' paychecks, Social Security, income tax, whatever, to the tune of $400,000. Mm-hmm. He said to the executive director, "Never again." Went out and borrowed $400,000 and paid those taxes. He and his fellow board members thereafter regularly asked the executive director, have all the taxes been paid? They were told yes. 2 years later, the executive director came forward and said, in fact, he'd not been paying all the taxes.
A second time?
A second time. Another $400,000. The hospital went into bankruptcy. Ultimately, the IRS went after the executive director, the chief financial officer, and the chairman of the board. And the person who wrote the check at the end of the day was the chairman of the board, $400,000, on a theory of willful blindness. He had been knowledgeable, he had actually taken some action, but had not followed through, and therefore he could be held financially responsible.
His willful blindness was that he asked the executive director, but he didn't follow up to see if the executive director was any more honest the second time around than he had been the first.
He didn't check enough. He didn't make sure somebody else was involved in the process, and in some people's eyes, he probably should have had that executive director showing the door.
And so your third category is presumably where the board itself does something wrong, and wrongdoing results in some kind of criminal prosecution?
That's right, or a board member. It doesn't have to be a collective board. I want to emphasize that. During my career, I prosecuted more than a dozen board of director members. Mm-hmm. In some cases, 4 individuals were chairmen of the boards that the time they were prosecuted, but I never prosecuted a whole board. That would be a very unusual step. But deliberate wrongdoing will lead to criminal prosecution no matter who you are, if you are knowingly, intentionally involved in that conduct. It can range from the obvious to the egregious. I had a member who'd sat on 40 different boards, and he got involved in insider trading, including cheating on the stocks of companies on whose boards he sat.
Wow.
That was an obvious case of criminal conduct, and he was punished severely. Some others are not so obvious. I had a board member who was here in California, sitting on a board in Minnesota, where he would come to board meetings 3 or 4 times a year. He was a co-founder of the company. He had a large equity stake in this private company, but he learned of wrongdoing that was going on as a company policy, cheating airlines, cheating state governments with regard to sales tax for luxury automobiles. And he also participated in this conduct, albeit on a very peripheral, periodic basis. Ultimately, he pled guilty to aiding and abetting wire fraud involving those airlines and sales tax fraud involving the state of California, even though he was not present for 99% of the wrongdoing.
So these are the 3 areas you've seen most commonly that directors get caught in. Mistakes, which result in civil liability.
Correct.
And willful blindness, where they just don't follow up enough, and that can be civil or criminal. And then direct wrongdoing, big or small,
Exactly.
by a director that is a criminal.
And it almost always starts small. As we've said on other occasions, very few directors, if any, that I prosecuted woke up the day of their offense and said, today's the day I'm going to risk everything. My reputation, my position, my liberty. It doesn't work that way. I prosecuted the chairman of the board of Buca, the Beppo restaurants. It started out with minor expense account abuse, cheating on things like meal reimbursement and gas reimbursement. It grew. It became a culture. It became something that all the senior executives in one form or another took part in. One year they didn't make their number. And the result of that was that none of these senior executives were going to get bonuses. So instead, following the lead of the chair, of the CEO, the senior executives, CFO, CIO, took their families on expensive vacations and then expensed it on the company expense account. This is of a publicly traded company where the shareholders paid for their vacations, their substitute bonuses. And it continued to grow from there. That was not the end of it, but the CEO and the CFO both went to prison for that conduct.
Over your 20 years as a federal prosecutor, and a very successful one from your reputation, did you increasingly focus on directors? I suspect that in the early days it was mostly on executives. Have directors become more a concern to prosecutors?
They certainly are more in the ambit. They're in the target area.
The crosshairs. No.
The crosshairs, in some people's views. I don't think there's any special effort, or certainly anything like a policy that singles out directors. But what they are recognizing as prosecutors in general is that the system has had a series of serious breakdowns, from corporate scandals to financial institution fraud to the current situation we find ourselves in. And there's an increasing desire on the part of legislators, certainly regulators, policy people, to hold more people to account, to say, what can we do differently? What can we do better than what we've been doing? And directors are very ready candidates because they are at the top of most organizational hierarchies. They are the ones who choose the CEO, who supervise the CEO. And increasingly people are asking, should directors be included when we find that there has been organizational wrongdoing on their watch?
Thank you.